Most people spend entire years trying to explain themselves to people who decided, a long time ago, who they are. And the scariest part is that no one notices this process while it's happening. They think communication failed. They think they chose the wrong words. They think that if they could just speak more clearly, act more carefully, bend a little more, then finally someone would see them. But Carl Jung, in works like Psychological Types and Ion, understood something darker about human nature. People rarely see you as you are. They see you as their minds allow you to exist. The moment that truth sinks in, your entire relationship with the world begins to change, because suddenly, something uncomfortable becomes clear. Every relationship silently carries two realities at the same time. Picture an ordinary Sunday dinner in any home. The table is set, the roast is in the center, the television murmurs low in the background. Everyone talks over each other about nothing. An uncle comments on gas prices. An aunt compliments another aunt's dress. Someone laughs at a joke nobody understood. And there's that one person. There's always one sitting in the corner. He observes. He doesn't say much. He notices that the aunt who complimented the dress is actually dying of envy. He notices that the father who laughs loudly is sadder than anyone imagines. He notices that the brother talking about his new job is lying about being happy. He notices that his mother, behind her automatic smile, has become a clock that no one knows the purpose of anymore. He doesn't want to see these things. They simply appear, like subtitles nobody asked for. And when, in a moment of courage, he tries to gently point out one of these invisible fractures, silence falls over the table like a heavy curtain. Then someone changes the subject, and he understands once again that seeing is a form of being alone. Jung described this long before any modern psychology manual. He believed that the psyche of certain individuals is born more permeable to the deep layers of the collective consciousness. It's as if, while most people come into the world with a protective film that filters out the excess, some are born without that filter. They feel before they understand. They perceive before they can name. And because of this, they become, within the groups where they live, what Jung called, in his writings on the archetypes, carriers of the shadow. Not because they're worse, but because they see what others invest enormous energy in not seeing. And here begins a story that might also be yours. Because no other thinker of the 20th century embodied this condition as much as Jung himself. Carl Jung was born in 1875 in a Swiss village called Kesswil, the son of a Protestant pastor and an emotionally unstable mother. From a very early age, he was an odd boy. While his classmates played in the streets, he would sit on a stone in the garden and spend hours wondering whether he was the one sitting on the stone or whether the stone was feeling his weight. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, a work dictated in the final years of his life to his assistant Agnella Jaffe, Jung describes with rare honesty this sensation of inhabiting two worlds at the same time. He said he felt divided between two personalities. One of them he called personality number one. It was the ordinary boy, the pastor's son, the schoolboy, who had to behave, get good grades, please the family. The other he called personality number two. It was an old man, an ancient man who had already lived centuries before him, who saw everything with a distant calm, who knew things a child shouldn't know. Even as a small boy, Jung felt that the second one was the real one, and that the first was a kind of performance he put on so he wouldn't frighten others. This isolated him from an early age. He couldn't bring himself to be interested in his father's conversations about theology. He found his mother unpredictable, almost frightening, with those sudden moments when she seemed possessed by another voice. And he also had violent dreams, full of strange images that crossed generations. One of his most famous dreams, recounted in the opening chapter of his autobiography, happened when he was between 3 and 4 years old. He dreamed of a hole in the ground, a staircase descending, an underground chamber, and an enormous figure seated on a throne covered in human skin. The boy woke up terrified. Only decades later did he understand that this dream contained in raw imagery the elements of what he himself would develop as the theory of the collective unconscious. Notice the detail. Jung was himself a black sheep. Not out of rebellion, not for drama, but because a part of him saw too much, too soon. And that, instead of destroying him, became the raw material of everything he would go on to build. The thinker who dedicated his life to studying the human psyche started out as a boy no one understood. And here is where the journey changes its tone. Because if Jung himself lived what he described, perhaps his description can serve as a map for you. One of the first structures Jung identified within the modern psyche was what he called the persona. The term comes from Latin and originally referred to the masks that actors wore in classical Roman theatre to play their roles. Jung reclaimed this word to describe the social mask that every individual builds throughout life to present themselves to the world. The persona is the professional face at the office, the cordial tone in the elevator, the smile at an acquaintance's wedding, the edited version we put on our social media profiles. It isn't false by nature. It's a necessary adaptation for living in society. The problem begins when the individual forgets that it's a mask, when he spends so many years wearing the same facade that the skin of the facade fuses to his real face, and then he no longer knows who he is underneath. In the Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, a collection gathering texts written over decades, Jung warns that this total identification with the persona is one of the great silent pathologies of modern man. A man wakes up at 50, looks in the mirror, and doesn't recognize anyone there. He spent his life being the model employee, the devoted father, the polite neighbor. He fulfilled every role, and in the process, he forgot to exist. That's why so many men, reaching middle age, fall into a crisis that the manuals try to explain in 1,000 ways, but which Jung explained with an almost simple phrase. The mask fell off, and there was no face behind it. The black sheep is that individual who, for some reason, never managed to glue the mask on perfectly. Maybe because his sensitivity was too great. Maybe because he grew up in an environment where the hypocrisy was too visible. Maybe because an ancient part of him, that personality number 2 Jung spoke of, refused to take part in the theatre. The result is that he spends his life watching everyone else's theatre. He sees the co-worker who pretends to admire the boss. He sees the couple who smile in public and never touch each other at home. He sees the pastor who preaches humility and collects expensive watches. And he feels like a foreigner within his own species. He isn't judging, he's just noticing. But noticing, in a world that agreed not to notice, is a silent crime. School already trains this crime. The employee of the month gets the trophy for wearing the right mask. The student considered mature is the one who learned to hide what he feels. The well-adjusted teenager is the one who has already mastered the vocabulary of appearances. And the one who resists, the one who still asks questions, the one who still notices too much, that one is sent to the school psychologist, gets labeled, gets medicated, gets advised to fit in. Jung would have said, the world isn't trying to heal that child. It's trying to teach them to lie more elegantly. And that, for their unconscious, is a wound that never closes. When that child grows up and still hasn't managed to erase their perception, they become a deeply tired adult. Tired of conversations that go in circles, of parties where nobody is truly present, of relationships where 2 bodies occupy the same room without 2 souls ever meeting. They start avoiding invitations, they choose silence, and in doing so, they're accused of arrogance, of coldness, of excessive introspection. No one realizes that what they're avoiding isn't people, but the continuous theatre. They would love real conversations. They would love eyes that could hold their gaze for more than 3 seconds. They would love a world where the persona was just clothing, not permanent skin. But the world they find is different. It's a world where surface matters more than substance, where being practical became a compliment and being deep became suspicious, where answering quickly counts more than thinking properly, where having opinions is treated as having personality, when, in truth, an opinion is just what's left over when the thinking never finished. In this environment, the one who insists on perceiving is pushed to the edges, not with open violence, but with a succession of small, silent exclusions, an invitation that never arrives, a conversation that changes subject when he gets close, a polite smile in place of one eye holding another, And here, the discussion needs to go deeper, because Jung offered an even more painful explanation for why this black sheep is so persistently pushed to the margins. He called this explanation the shadow. The shadow, in analytical psychology, is the collection of everything the individual represses, denies, hides, or refuses to recognize in themselves. It's the cowardice of the brave. It's the pettiness of the generous. It's the forbidden desire of the virtuous. Everyone has a shadow, because no ego can be whole without excluding a part of itself. The problem is what we do with that excluded part. According to Jung, it doesn't disappear. It sinks to the bottom of the psyche, and from there it projects itself onto the external world. You hate in others exactly what you refuse to see in yourself. That's why the angriest speeches against a particular group usually come from those who secretly carry traits that resemble that very group. Jung took this concept beyond the individual. He showed that groups, families, organizations, and even nations have their collective shadow. Nobody wants to be the defective one in the family. Nobody wants to be the failure of the friend group. Nobody wants to be the incompetent one at work. So, unconsciously, all the members elect someone to carry these denied qualities. It's a silent pact, a psychic scapegoat. As long as he's the problematic one, the others can feel healthy. As long as he's the difficult one, the others can feel normal. As long as he carries the group's shadow, the group doesn't have to look at itself. Pay close attention to this mechanism because it is subtle and brutal at the same time. Very often, what the family criticizes most in the rejected member is exactly what it represses most. The brother called crazy is frequently the only one expressing everyone's madness. The daughter called rebellious is the one giving voice to the revolt the others swallowed. The distant cousin is the one who dared to make the choices the rest didn't have the courage to make. The black sheep, in these cases, isn't just suffering. They're performing an invisible service. They're being the mirror the family needs and, at the same time, refuses to look at. And, like every uncomfortable mirror, they're constantly covered with a cloth. This helps explain why, even as an adult, even after moving far away, even after building a life of your own, the simple act of returning to your parents' house at Christmas can make you regress instantly. You walk through the door, and within minutes, you're reduced back to the role the family decided you occupy. Your aunt starts commenting on your weight. Your father cracks a joke about your career choices. Your mother asks, in that old tone, if you've ever thought about something more stable. It isn't conscious malice. It's the gravitational pull of a system that needs to keep every piece in its place. And your place in that system was defined before you had a voice. When you understand this, something loosens inside. You stop believing there's something wrong with you for not belonging. You start to understand that your rejection isn't a measure of your human worth. It's a measure of how much the group needs to keep its shadows hidden. And the more awareness you develop, the more discomfort the group will feel in your presence. Not because you did something, but because, by your simple existence, others are forced to remember what they'd rather forget. And here the road begins to open up. Because from this point on, the video stops being about why you suffer, and it starts being about what to do with that suffering. But before that, we need to go deeper. We need to look directly at the cost of this early awareness. Because if no one explains this cost, you'll keep believing the loneliness is your fault. The price of seeing doesn't show up on any bill. It shows up in the middle of the night, when the bedroom ceiling becomes a screen, and you lie there staring at it for hours, unable to sleep and unable to name what you feel. It shows up in the blue light of your phone reflected on your face, scrolling through app conversations where nobody says anything and everybody seems busy. It shows up in that strange feeling of leaving a social gathering with people who genuinely like you and still coming home lonelier than you were before you left. It shows up in the specific exhaustion of faking enthusiasm in a morning work meeting when your interior is as silent as an empty cathedral. That exhaustion isn't laziness. It's the energetic cost of constantly translating your internal language into an external language the world understands. Jung had a precise insight about this. He claimed that as an individual's consciousness expands, the distance between him and the collective unconsciousness of the group increases, not because the individual has become superior, but because he has begun to inhabit frequencies the herd doesn't yet visit. And, like every distinct frequency, it generates noise. Conversations start to sound mechanical. Parties become endurance exercises. Superficial relationships lose all appeal. And the individual wonders whether he's getting sick or finally waking up. Jung would say he's waking up, but waking up in a world that sleeps is a lonely experience. You look at your co-workers talking excitedly about last night's football game, commenting on the restaurant that opened on the corner while thumb-scrolling through images of some random TV show, and you feel a strange tenderness mixed with estrangement. You understand that those conversations serve a function. They numb. They fill the rooms where, without them, the questions nobody wants to hear would echo. You don't judge those who take part in them, but you can no longer take part the way you used to. And that inability isn't an attitude, it's development. There's a fundamental difference between the loner by choice and the loner by consciousness. The first chooses isolation as a strategy. The second finds it as a consequence. The black sheep who saw too much almost always belongs to the second group. They didn't decide to be different. They simply couldn't stop perceiving what they saw. And the world, which needs unconsciousness in order to function, pushed them into the corners, where those who see don't disturb those who sleep. Here, a pause is important. If you've made it this far into the video, you probably recognized parts of yourself in every line. And maybe you're feeling that mix of relief and sadness that only happens when someone finally puts into words what you always knew but could never say. Hold on to that feeling. It will be important later on. Because that feeling is precisely the raw material of individuation. But before we get there, there's an even deeper layer to examine. A layer where personal suffering begins to connect with something greater than individual biography. Jung discovered, by studying his patients' dreams, the myths of ancient civilizations, medieval alchemical texts, and Eastern religions, that there are images, symbols, and themes that repeat across cultures that never had contact with one another. The flood appears in mythologies as distant as the Mesopotamian, the Greek, and the Mayan. The figure of the protective mother, the hero who descends into the world of the dead, the wise old man, the trickster, the divine child, appears in narratives separated by oceans and centuries. How do we explain this if there was no direct cultural borrowing between these peoples? Jung formulated a hypothesis that revolutionized psychology. He proposed that there exists, beneath each individual's personal psyche, a deeper layer, common to all of humanity, made not of individual memories, but of inherited structures. He called this layer the collective unconscious, and its fundamental building blocks he called archetypes. This idea was developed in works like Symbols of Transformation, originally published between 1911 and 1912, and later refined in the Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious. For Jung, the archetype is not a specific image, but a structural predisposition to form certain images. It's as if the human psyche came with a ready-made grammar, and each culture filled that grammar with its own vocabulary. The black sheep, whose psyche is more permeable, has more direct access to this common ground, and that's why they feel things that seem to have no personal cause. They can wake up with an inexplicable sadness that doesn't belong to their week. They can intuit tragedies before they happen. They can feel, upon entering a room, the emotional temperature of everyone present. They can dream of landscapes they've never seen, of people they've never met, of symbols they'll only discover later in ancient books. They can feel, upon reading a Greek myth for the first time, that they already knew that story somewhere before the page ever existed. They can recognize, in a painting from centuries ago, the exact internal state they're going through that very week. This isn't cheap mysticism. It's what Jung considered a real psychological characteristic of certain temperaments. And, in a materialist world that reduces the soul to the brain, these perceptions make the individual feel like they're losing their mind. They aren't losing their mind. They're tuned in to something most of the culture around them ignores. But this attunement has a cost, because nobody taught them how to handle it. You receive the waves, but you don't have the receiver. You feel the weight, but you don't know where it comes from. You carry anguish that isn't yours, but you haven't yet developed the vocabulary to separate what's yours from what's inherited. And this is where Jung introduces another concept that needs to be understood calmly, because it explains a good deal of family suffering. A concept that might change, forever, the way you look at your parents. Jung used the word complex to describe the set of psychic contents, charged with emotion and organized around a common core. Every individual has complexes. Some are conscious, others are not. The mother complex forms around the experience with the maternal figure, the father complex around the experience with the paternal figure. These complexes don't come only from the real mother and father. They also come from the archetypal images of mother and father that exist in the collective unconscious. That's why even someone who had a loving mother can carry a heavy mother complex. Even someone who had an absent father can idealize a paternal figure that reality never offered. But Jung went further. He observed, both in his clinical practice and in his reading of myths, that much of what children live unconsciously is what remained unlived in their parents. If a father secretly wanted to be an artist, but chose the security of an administrative job, it's common for one of his children to feel an overwhelming artistic calling that he himself can't explain. If a mother repressed her sexuality, it's frequent for one of her daughters to live a conflicted sexual life, as if trying to resolve within herself her mother's unlived life. It isn't magic. It's the invisible psychic transmission that crosses generations through gestures, glances, silences, and unspoken phrases. The black sheep is usually the family member most often elected for this silent task, precisely because they're the most sensitive, the most permeable, the most receptive to the group's unconscious contents. They end up absorbing what the others manage to block out. They carry, without knowing it, the dream their grandfather abandoned, the pain their great-grandmother never processed, the rage their uncle never expressed. And because of this, their suffering seems disproportionate to their biography. They look back at the concrete facts of their life and find nothing that justifies such internal density. But that's because their internal density doesn't come only from their own life. It comes from an entire lineage that finally found, in them, the point where it can look at itself in the mirror. This is one of the reasons so many individuals like this feel older than their actual age. They feel an ancientness inside themselves that doesn't correspond to their date of birth. And this ancientness is literal in the Jungian sense, because it's made of the layers of everything that came before. A great-grandfather who fled the war and never told the real reason. A grandmother who lost a small child in the epidemic and never cried in public, only hardened inside in a silence that passed from generation to generation. An aunt who left her marriage for the love of another man and spent decades punishing herself with small gestures of renunciation. A father who dreamed of the sea and became an accountant. These silent stories don't disappear. They become atmosphere. And that atmosphere is breathed by those who come after, without anyone ever needing to say a word. Understanding this doesn't eliminate the pain, but it transforms your relationship with it. It stops being a sign that something in you is defective. It becomes a sign that something in you is fertile. You aren't the child who broke the lineage. You are the child through whom the lineage can finally be seen. And if you have the courage to look back, you can become the one in whom certain ancient cycles finally come to an end. Before moving on, a practical note. Understanding philosophy is interesting. Practicing philosophy can change your life. Start with the link I left in the first pinned comment. There is a moment in the life of almost every individual who begins to wake up when they feel the temptation to go back to sleep. It isn't weakness, it's exhaustion. Waking up in a world that insists on dozing is exhausting. And, at a certain point, an extremely seductive internal proposal appears. The proposal is, what if I simply stopped seeing? What if I accepted the dead-end job they're offering me? What if I married someone I don't love, just so I won't be alone? What if I drank more at dinners, so the conversations would seem interesting? What if I agreed with opinions I find absurd, just to get invited again? This proposal seems liberating. It promises the end of loneliness, the end of strangeness, the end of that internal foreignness. And, for a while, it works. You start receiving more invitations. People start commenting on how much lighter you seem. Your mother sleeps better because finally, you seem well-adjusted. Your department manager smiles in a new way, as if you've finally understood the rules. You feel a fragile peace, made of small approvals added up over the days. The individual numbs themselves, accepts, agrees, laughs at the jokes, fits in. People start calling them lighter, calmer, more mature. They begin to believe they've finally found their place. But inside, something silent begins to rot. Jung described this process with a clarity that still impresses today. He claimed that betraying your own consciousness has a price, and that price is neurosis. When the individual knows deep down what they should do and repeatedly chooses the opposite in order to belong, they develop an internal tension that the body and mind can't manage indefinitely. The symptoms appear: the insomnia that obeys no schedule, the anxiety that shows up for no apparent reason, the back pain that no orthopedist can explain, the sadness with no address, the panic attacks in the middle of the commute to work, seeing the line of cars in the traffic jam and realizing, for an instant, that that line is your life. These symptoms are the language of the unconscious. It's trying to say something the conscious mind refuses to hear. It's saying, you've abandoned the route. It doesn't speak in words. It speaks in body, in image, in dream, in symptom. And the worst thing you can do is silence it. Silence it with alcohol, with screens, with excessive work, with relationships that serve only to fill space, with consumption, with busyness. Each silencing is a dose of anesthesia that, the next day, demands a bigger dose. Jung said, in essays collected in works like The Practice of Psychotherapy, that neurosis shouldn't be seen only as a problem. It is also a call. The symptom is the soul asking for space. It's the psyche trying to restore a lost balance. If the conscious mind insists on a direction that betrays the individual's wholeness, the unconscious reacts. And the reaction takes the form of what medicine calls mental illness, but which Jung interpreted as a sign that the direction needs to be reconsidered. This means the anguish of the black sheep can be read in another way. It may not be a sign that something is wrong with you. It may be a sign that something is being asked of you. And this request is never for you to adjust to what no longer fits. The request is always for you to begin adjusting to yourself, even if it dismantles the life you've built, even if it disappoints the people you love, even if it places you even more on the outside. The path of individuation, as Jung called it, is not comfortable. It demands, before anything else, a reversal in the direction of your gaze. You've spent your life seeing the herd. Now, you need to start seeing yourself with the same clarity. And here begins the hardest part, because seeing the world is easy. Seeing your own darkness is the real work. And it was exactly here that Jung took a step that the academic psychology of his time never fully forgave him for. Jung left behind a phrase that became one of the most quoted of his work. It appears in variations throughout several of his writings, and is the axis of the entire psychotherapeutic work he proposed. The phrase says, in essence, that no one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. This statement seems simple, but it dismantles centuries of misunderstood spirituality. What it means is that there's no real transformation without confronting the personal shadow. You can meditate for decades, you can read every philosophy book, you can practice every self-help technique available on the market. If you don't descend into the part of yourself you don't want to look at, none of these practices will produce true change. They'll only polish your persona. They'll make your mask more convincing, and the emptiness will remain there, disguised by a more sophisticated vocabulary. The black sheep, at the beginning of their awakening process, usually projects all the darkness outward. The problem is the family. The problem is the boss. The problem is society. The problem is the unconscious herd that doesn't want to wake up. And up to a point, these diagnoses are real. The wounds caused by these environments are real. But if the process stops there, the individual freezes into an identity of enlightened victim. They start taking pride in being above it all. They start defining themselves by what they reject. And without realizing it, they build a new persona, now made of superiority and distance. A persona of the conscious exile, which is also a mask. Jung was relentless on this point. He said that recognizing other people's flaws is trivial. Recognizing your own is the beginning of maturity. And the black sheep has specific flaws, born of their condition. They often carry a silent pride in seeing what others don't see. They carry an old anger at having been rejected, and that anger can turn into elegant contempt. They carry a secret desire to be special, and that desire can dress itself up as a calling. They carry a fear of other people's judgment, and that fear can disguise itself as independence. Facing these truths about yourself is the most painful stage of individuation, because it means stepping down from the pedestal of the one who suffered unjustly, and recognizing that, although the suffering was real, part of the role was also actively constructed. You were rejected, yes, but at some point, you started rejecting yourself before others could. You were misunderstood, yes, but at some point, you started presenting yourself in a way that was hard to understand, almost to prove that no one can. And although the wounds were real, there came a point when you started wounding back, with the subtle weapon of withdrawal, of silence, of superiority elegantly disguised as indifference. This recognition doesn't erase the original pain, but it gives back power. Because the moment you admit your participation in the game, you stop being merely the object of the game. You become the subject, and being the subject, you can choose to play a different game. Here the journey begins to change in nature. It stops being about blaming the world. It stops being about justifying your own suffering, and it starts being about building from the broken pieces, a wholeness. Jung gave this construction the name that became the center of his entire body of work. He called this process individuation. Individuation is the process by which an individual becomes what they are. At first glance, it sounds like a tautology. Isn't someone already what they are simply by existing? No, and that is the discovery Jung turned into his life's work. Most people spend their lives being what others expect, being what the culture demands, being what the family projects, being what the historical moment requires. They never get to become what, deep down, they always were. They die without ever knowing themselves. Individuation is the conscious decision, sustained over the years, to walk the opposite path. It's dismantling the layers of other people's expectations. It's integrating the rejected parts of yourself. It's reconciling conscious and unconscious. It's bringing together persona, shadow, complexes, archetypes, so that the individual becomes a coherent center. Jung called this center the self. He wrote extensively about it in works like Ion, a study on the phenomenology of the self, published in 1951, and in the relations between the ego and the unconscious, a seminal text in which he precisely distinguishes the ego from the self. The ego is the conscious part of the psyche. It's the you that answers to your name, has opinions, plans dinner, decides what to wear. The ego is important. Without it, there's no functional daily life. But the ego is only a small part of the psychic totality. The self is that totality. It's the center that includes everything, the conscious and the unconscious, the known and the yet to be known, the light and the shadow. Jung suggested in some passages that the self functions as an internal image of the sacred, not in the institutional religious sense, but as an organizing center that brings order to the multiplicity of the psyche. When the ego aligns with the self, the individual experiences something he called quite plainly meaning, not shallow happiness, not euphoria, meaning. The sensation that your life has direction, that your choices obey an internal logic, that the fragmentation has diminished and something has come together inside. For the black sheep, this perspective changes everything. because it means the goal of the journey was never to belong to the herd. The goal is to belong to yourself. It isn't about acquiring external acceptance. It's about acquiring internal coherence. And when that coherence begins to form, something curious happens. The need for other people's approval diminishes, not because you became insensitive, but because your anchor has moved from outside to inside. You stop needing others to validate your way of being in the world. You yourself, silently, validate it. And that isn't arrogance, it's psychological maturity. The mature person, in the Jungian sense, is one who can live with other people's displeasure without collapsing, who can make an unpopular decision without needing to convince everyone, who can be alone without dissolving into loneliness, not because they're cold, but because they know that the root sustaining them is inside them and not in the opinion of the month. The path to that point is not linear. Jung said that individuation happens in spirals, not in straight lines. The individual advances, retreats, finds a new aspect of themselves, rejects it, faces it again, integrates it, advances again. And in each turn of the spiral, they pass through similar themes, but at different depths. What, at 20, was a vague sense of displacement, at 40 can turn into a direct confrontation with the shadow. And, if the work continues, at 60, it can become a new serenity, made not of denying the pain, but of integrating it. The unconscious, in this process, is an ally. It isn't an adversary to be silenced, it's a guide to be listened to. And it communicates through three main languages, which Jung spent his life studying. The first is the dream. The second is the symbol. The third is synchronicity. And there is, within these languages, a practice so simple it seems naive, one that Jung kept as a kind of silent key to the entire process. About dreams, Jung wrote so much that it would be impossible to summarize here, but the essential point is this. He believed the dream is not merely residue from the day, as part of the psychology of his era suggested. The dream is a living message from the unconscious to the conscious mind. It brings images that need to be interpreted not literally, but as symbols. A lion in a dream can represent an instinctive force. An old house can represent forgotten aspects of your own psyche. An encounter with an unknown figure can represent an aspect of the unconscious that wants to be integrated. Dream work, done with patience over years, becomes one of the most concrete paths to individuation. The practice is simple to start. All you need is a notebook and a pencil beside the bed and the commitment to write down, upon waking, whatever fragment remains. In the first weeks, the notes seem like garbage. Loose scenes, shapeless sensations, nameless characters. You get discouraged. You close the notebook, then you come back. And if you persist for months, something begins to change. The images gain clarity. The sentences come out whole. Over time, patterns appear. Images that repeat. Settings that return. Characters that evolve. Each of these patterns is a clue about what the psyche is trying to work through. The black sheep, especially sensitive to this territory, finds in dreams an interlocutor they rarely found in external relationships. An interlocutor who speaks their language. The second channel is the symbol. Jung studied symbols from every tradition. Eastern mandalas, alchemical symbols, figures from Greek mythology, Christian religious images, prehistoric art. He believed that certain symbols speak directly to the unconscious, activating contents that words cannot reach. A mandala drawn in a moment of internal chaos can, by itself, restore some order. A symbol that appears repeatedly in someone's life is rarely a coincidence. It's pointing to something that wants to be integrated. The third channel is the most controversial, but also one of the most impressive. Jung called it synchronicity. It's the experience of external events that coincide, in a meaningful way, with internal states. You think of an old friend, and the phone rings with their name on the screen. You're going through a dilemma, and a sentence in a book opened at random answers your exact question. You dream of a specific animal, and the next day, that animal crosses your path. Jung didn't claim these coincidences have a physical cause. He proposed that there is a principle of meaningful connection between psyche and world, which manifests in moments of intense emotional charge or psychic transition. Synchronicity isn't superstition, it's the experience that the world, at certain moments, seems to blink back in response. The black sheep is often familiar with these experiences. And, contrary to what materialist culture suggests, paying attention to them isn't a sign of mental fragility, it's a sign that the individual is learning to read the texts that were always in front of them. Texts written in an ink that only patient attention reveals. All these elements converge toward a turning point in meaning. The black sheep's life stops being a succession of purposeless rejections. It begins to organize itself around a calling Jung referred to in some passages as vocation, and in others as individual destiny, not in the naive religious sense, but in the rigorous psychological sense. Every individual has within themselves a form that wants to come into being. When they align with that form, their life gains coherence. When they betray it, they get sick. The form can be anything. It can be becoming a teacher, an artist, an engineer, a therapist, a caregiver, a scientist, a farmer, a writer, a carpenter. The content doesn't matter as much as the fidelity. What matters is that it's truly yours, not a repetition of what your father wanted, not a reaction to what your mother wanted, not an imitation of what the culture sells as success, but a choice that responds to what that individual, and only that individual, was called to be. Here, marginality acquires a new status. What once seemed like exclusion now reveals itself as liberation. While most of the herd spends decades negotiating with other people's desires, trying to mold themselves into shapes that aren't theirs, the black sheep was pushed out of the circle far too early. That which hurt was also a bitter gift, because it placed them, sooner than they would have liked, before the fundamental question: if no one here approves, what remains? What remains is you, and with you remains an entire life to be built from something that is true. Jung believed, and wrote this in several passages, that the individual who seriously walks the path of individuation performs a service to humanity, even without publicity, even in silence. Because by integrating their own rejected parts, they reduce the collective shadow. By living more aligned with their self, they contribute to raising, even by the smallest fraction, the consciousness of the species. A whole person transforms the field around them without needing to convince anyone of anything. Their simple presence changes the temperature of the rooms they walk into. Their simple existence opens space for others to begin recognizing themselves as well. This means the black sheep's exile has a function. It isn't an accident. It's a vocation. The pain of rejection, when crossed and integrated, converts into depth. And depth, in the world we live in, is the rarest currency. Contemporary culture generates a lot of noise with very little voice underneath. Avalanches of opinions that are almost never complete thoughts, and a constant connection between people who rarely truly meet. In this scenario, the one who spent years inhabiting silence, learning to distinguish what is theirs from what is inherited, becomes, without fanfare, someone necessary. Not because they're superior, but because they had the time, forced upon them, to look inward. And with time, the loneliness changes texture. It stops being that feeling of standing outside with your nose pressed against the glass, and it becomes something different, a kind of habitable internal space, a silent room where it's possible to think, a place where your own company stops being unbearable and becomes fertile. Jung literally lived this distinction. In 1923, he began building, with his own hands, a stone tower in Bollingen on the shore of Lake Zurich. He continued building over decades, adding rooms, floors, wings. The Bollingen Tower had no electricity for many years, no telephone, none of the many conveniences of modern life. Jung retreated there regularly. He chopped his own firewood, cooked for himself, wrote, painted mandalas on the walls, carved stone. He called that tower his confession in stone. It was the space where he could be whole, without interference from the world, without the pressure of the persona. The Bollingen Tower wasn't an escape. It was the architecture of individuation. Jung needed a place that reflected, in external space, the work he was doing in internal space. And, by building it over the years, with layers corresponding to stages of his own life, he materialized the process. You don't need a Swiss tower to do the same. You don't need land, money, or abundant free time. You need, each in your own way, to build an equivalent internal space, a place inside yourself where no outside opinion enters, a silent room where you can think, feel, decide without an audience. It can be a specific chair by a window, a fixed hour before sunrise, a notebook no one opens but you, a walk that repeats at the same time every day, an invisible tower made of protected time, careful reading, chosen conversations, respected silences. Without that internal tower, the individual is always swallowed by the noise. With it, they begin to truly exist. And the loneliness, which was once a prison, becomes a laboratory. You no longer seek to escape it. You begin to inhabit it with a new serenity. The fate of the black sheep who saw too much is not, therefore, bitterness. It isn't permanent cynicism. It isn't fleeing to a cabin in the middle of nowhere. It isn't elegant contempt for the ordinary world. Those would be mere consolation prizes for a wounded ego. The true destiny is something else. It's becoming an individual. An individual, in the literal sense, is one who can no longer be divided because their parts have finally been integrated. Someone in whom conscious and unconscious converse. Someone in whom persona and shadow recognize each other. Someone in whom the ego serves the self and not the other way around. Someone who, even surrounded by masks, keeps a face. This kind of individual is rare, always has been, not because most people are incapable, but because few choose to pay the price. The price of individuation is high. It's losing friendships that depended on your old persona. It's disappointing family members who needed your old role. It's crossing long periods when the new hasn't yet been born and the old has already died. It's giving up approvals that provided some comfort. It's admitting contradictions you'd rather not see. But the price of not paying that price is even higher. It's living an entire life alongside your own life. It's dying without ever having arrived. You, who made it this far, probably know this, even without words. You feel deep down that you've already begun the process. Maybe still timidly, hesitantly, with many falls, but you've begun. And once begun, it's almost impossible to fully return to the herd. The taste of your own thinking, once experienced, permanently contaminates the anesthetic drinks. You can even try. But every time you go back to the herd, an internal voice will whisper that you're lying, and that voice will never go silent again. The path, therefore, is to keep going, but to keep going in a different way, not as a victim, not as an exile, not as the misunderstood one, but as someone who accepted, with all the risks, the task of becoming who they are. This task has no manual. Each individual needs to invent their own rhythm, their own vocabulary, their own rituals, but it has signs. And the signs appear to those who learn to look. One sign is the increasingly frequent sensation that your choices, even the smallest ones, are beginning to obey an internal logic. Another sign is the gradual decrease in the need to justify yourself to others. Yet another sign is the new capacity to be in a group without dissolving, and to be alone without panicking. Another is patience with your own darkness. You stop treating your difficult parts as enemies to be eliminated, and start treating them as parts of yourself to be listened to. You become gentler with your own pettiness, without surrendering to it. You learn to embrace the old anger, without handing it to the world as if it were justice. And the sadness, which once threatened to drown you, becomes just a room you enter and know how to leave. That is the tone of mature individuation. It isn't euphoria. It isn't victory. It isn't an advertising billboard. It's a new calm made of years of work. A calm that knows the pain will return, that the loneliness will return, that the strangeness will return, but that also knows there is, inside, a tower that none of these states can ever fully invade. And it's from that tower that the black sheep begins to operate. They keep working, keep relating to others, keep participating in the world. But they no longer confuse the world with themselves. They offer what they can offer, stay silent when they need to stay silent, withdraw when they need to withdraw, come closer when it makes sense to come closer. Their life stops being reactive and becomes intentional. And intention, in the Jungian sense, is one of the highest forms of human freedom, because at the end of the day, almost all adult unhappiness comes down to living in response. Responding to your parents' demands, responding to your colleagues' gaze, responding to the algorithm, responding to the expectations of a world that doesn't even know who you are. When someone finally stops responding and starts proposing, from within, a different temperature settles in. That temperature is neither warm nor cold. It is steady. If you've made it to this point, there's one last thing to be said. Something simple, almost childlike. Do today something that only you would do, not something big, not something spectacular. Something small, but true. A choice that corresponds to who you are and not to what's expected of you. It can be not replying to a message you only replied to out of obligation. An open notebook in the kitchen with a sentence no one will ever read works too. Maybe it's a walk with no destination and no audience, stepping out the door before the phone starts demanding your return. Or it can be just a cup of coffee in silence, no screen in front of you, looking out the window like someone who accepts, for a few minutes, existing without a function. A minimal gesture, but yours. No audience, no approval, no justification. That gesture is the first step of individuation, and once taken, it wants company. Tomorrow, one more, then another. The life of the black sheep who saw too much is built like this, with small acts of fidelity repeated over the years, until, one day, they look back and realize they're no longer the same. That they no longer belong to the herd, it's true, but that they no longer need to, because silently, they have begun to belong to themselves. If this video touched something in you that was asleep, leave a like so that others like you can also find this path. Subscribe to the channel so we can continue this journey together, and consider joining our members club to access deeper content and exclusive reflections. The herd follows its path. You finally follow yours.